In a previous narrated PowerPoint, we discussed the importance of being on top of our ministry in a crisis. Now today, we will talk about pastoral ministry in a trauma, Part 1. Welcome back to Pastoral Ministry 402. This is Steve Googe welcoming you to yet another presentation that hopefully will equip you to minister to those who are engaged in some sort of wound in their life. Now, what should you expect to learn today? You will learn a medical definition of trauma as well as a definition of emotional trauma. You will look at some of the worst types of trauma for ministry, and then the common themes of trauma. We'll look at this material together. Let's get started. On this slide, let's briefly distinguish between a loss, a crisis, and a trauma, because they are different things. Loss produces an ache, an emptiness, a sadness. Often, a loss is associated with death, or the loss of something very special to the individual. A crisis throws us off balance. It throws us into a state of shock, panic, and uncertainty. It causes our world to be turned upside down, at least temporarily. And then trauma, which is the subject of this narrated PowerPoint, is a wounding. It overwhelms our senses. It rewires our brain, literally. It causes brain chemistry to change. Those are some of the differences between a loss, a crisis, and trauma. A trauma means a wound. It's the response to any event that shatters or wounds your safe world. H. Norman Wright has said, if you have attended a rodeo, you've probably seen a rider pursuing a steer. He guides his horse next to that galloping steer, and at the precise moment leaps from his horse, grabs the steer's horns, and pulls it to a dusty halt. With the right amount of pressure at the right time, he literally throws that steer to the ground. When you experience trauma, you're thrown about like that steer. Your world turns wild. It's out of control. What we used to see as a safe world is no longer safe. What we used to see as a predictable world is no longer that way. Most people never dream that negative events will produce personal trauma. Perhaps that's why it is so devastating when bad things arrive. At this time, over 75% of the general population in our country have been exposed to some event that meets the criteria of a trauma. The good news is that only about 25% of those who are exposed to such events become traumatized. You'll see in the picture above a cowboy wrestling a steer. Perhaps that would be a good image for you to remember as you think of the word trauma. And so here is a definition of trauma. It has 3 points that I want to share with you. In a physical trauma, the word means a serious injury or shock to the body, as from violence or an accident. Some part of the body is impacted with such powerful force that the body's natural protections, such as the skin or bones, can't prevent the injury. And then the body's normal, natural healing capacities can't mend the injuries without some assistance. But there's not only physical trauma, there's also emotional trauma. The word can be used to refer to an emotional wound or a shock that creates substantial, lasting damage to the psychological development of a person. In Part 2 of Pastoral Ministry and Trauma, we will take a look at post-traumatic stress disorder as an example of being psychologically traumatized. And then a simple general definition is an event or situation that causes great distress and disruption of one's life. Trauma is the response to any event that shatters your world. It's more than a state of crisis. We talked about crisis earlier, and typically a crisis can be resolved in about 6 months. But trauma leaves you feeling unsafe because your place of refuge has been invaded. The word trauma, as we have seen, comes from a Greek word that means a wound. It's a condition characterized by the phrase, "I just can't seem to get over it." Emotionally, you can be wounded in the same way as you can be wounded physically. You can be assaulted so much emotionally that your beliefs about yourself and life, your will to grow, your spirit, your dignity, and your sense of security are all damaged. You end up feeling helpless. You can experience this for a period of time in a crisis, but then bounce back. However, in a trauma, you have a difficult time bouncing back because you feel depersonalized. In a trauma, something happens in your brain that affects the way you process information. It affects how you interpret and store the event you experienced. On this slide, you will see a suggestive list of some of the worst ways trauma occurs. This is not an exhaustive list, mind you. But number 1, violence involving multiple murders. And number 2, any catastrophe involving children. An example of this is the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting. It occurred on November the 14th, 2012 in Newtown, Connecticut. 20-year-old Adam Lanza fatally shot 20 children. The children were age 6 and 7. There were also 6 adult staff members who were killed. Prior to driving to the school, Lanza shot and killed his mother at their Newburgh home, and then as first responders arrived, this young man committed suicide by shooting himself in the head. These are among the worst kinds of traumas that can occur, and it takes years for people to reach the point of coming back to stability. And then another shooting took place on December the 2nd, 2015, where 14 people were killed and 22 others were seriously wounded in a terrorist attack at the Inland Regional Center in San Bernardino, California. This consisted of a mass shooting and an attempted bombing. This certainly traumatized our entire nation. And then plane crashes, where there is no recovery of bodies. You perhaps will remember the Malaysian Air Flight 370. It was a scheduled international passenger flight operated by Malaysia Air. It just disappeared on March the 8th, 2014, over the South China Sea. Soon after takeoff, the plane changed courses. Malaysian military radar continued to track the aircraft as it diverted westward from its planned path and crossed the Malay Peninsula. It left the range of Malay military radar over the Andaman Sea, 200 nautical miles northwest of Penang in northwest Malaysia. It was carrying a crew of 12 Malaysian crew members and 227 passengers from 15 nations. And those bodies have not been recovered. And then number 4, MIAs, those who are missing in action, perhaps prisoners of war who are not accounted for. Those make up some of the worst ways trauma can occur. There are several common themes of trauma. It can strike anyone. It's unpredictable. You think you're dropping your child off at a daycare center or a high school, and your spouse goes to work, or a parent boards a plane, and then suddenly trauma enters your world. Perhaps you remember where you were in 9/11. I certainly do. And I remember how that traumatized all of us in this country. And then trauma leaves us feeling unsafe. Trauma separates us from safety. It's invasive. It invades all areas of our lives. It must be dealt with in a unique way for each one of us. And then it involves loss. Trauma means that nothing will be the same again. that our world has changed in a huge way. We see that with, again, the 9/11 bombings by the terrorists. Trauma makes us feel overwhelmed. It often is unspeakable. Trauma can change or challenge even our view of God. Trauma produces hyperarousal, hyper-alertness, and hypersensitivity. In a church I served in Charlotte, North Carolina, we had a wonderful couple who had moved to Charlotte from Texas. But in their church there was a shooting. They happened to be present on that particular Sunday morning. And so after they moved to Charlotte, I noticed they always sat toward the back of the church. They always tried to place themselves so that they could get to the exit. Why? They were traumatized by what had happened several years earlier in a church shooting. They were hyper alert about the possibility of another shooting taking place. These are some of the common themes of trauma, and now we'll go to 3 additional of these common themes on the next slide. We've examined some of the common themes of trauma. It can strike anyone. Trauma leaves us feeling unsafe. It involves a loss. Trauma makes us feel overwhelmed. It is often unspeakable. Trauma can change or challenge our view of God. And trauma produces hyperarousal, hyper-alertness, and hypersensitivity. Now on this slide, let's add 3 additional common themes of trauma. Those traumatized often re-experience the trauma. Every new trauma activates the old one. It taps into all the old stuff. Just like the couple I mentioned earlier, couple from Texas who moved to Charlotte. They had a tendency of tapping into the old stuff. Therefore, they sat at the back of the church so they could exit quickly if a similar event reoccurred. And then it leads to feelings of helplessness. However, I would go on to say that about 2/3 of the victims of trauma grow in a positive way. Many of them develop a greater appreciation for life. Many of them deepen their spiritual beliefs and feel stronger and build closer relationships. It's just a matter of us as ministers helping them walk through this period when they're wounded. And then trauma does not make sense. It just simply defies explanations. Those are the common themes of trauma. On this slide, I want you to use this iceberg as a critical thinking tool to reflect on trauma. One of the most important parts of critical thinking is background knowledge. Background knowledge informs critical thinking at multiple levels, and I believe it is one of the most important components of critical thinking. But you can't reach the point of learning critical thinking in a semester of study. The most important component of critical thinking really can't be taught. That is, background knowledge. Background knowledge comes from learning and living in the world and paying attention to what's going on. Mastering the component of critical thinking called background knowledge requires that a person dedicate themselves to be a lifelong learner, having a genuine openness to different points of view and a certain humility in the face of all that you don't know. This isn't a set of skills you can master with worksheets and worked examples. It's a philosophy. It's a lifestyle choice. And textbooks don't teach you about the importance of background knowledge. Now, I want you to begin using your own experience, your own learnings from life itself, and your experience in the world, as well as all you have learned here at Fruitland Baptist Bible College or other institutions of higher learning. I want you to now look at this particular iceberg illustration and spend some time thinking critically about trauma and how it relates to what you see before you. Good luck in your exercise.